Okay. So, this is the part of the day where my brain starts to melt. But thank you all for, particularly those of you who've been with us all day. I wanted to take this window because we've seen Symoné's work just after lunch, which was wonderful, thank you. But we haven't had an introduction of it from yourself and how that might relate to metamodernism. So if you don't mind saying a few words about how you feel it sits, that would be great.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Great. My name is Symoné. My pronouns are she or they. I'm a performance artist, circus performer, and cabaret artist. I've been performing for around 7 years. And I kind of delve in between performance art, cabaret, and also video game development. And this current work is kind of happened as I've been developing myself in that space. It's a new work I've been developing over the past month, Highway to Infinity. And I guess in terms of metamodernism, it's a new topic for me. And I think when I'm in the beginning stages of a work, I find it a little bit difficult to articulate what and how things relate. So I guess I'd be happy to tell you a little bit about the work in depth if that's useful, and for you to yourself to kind of put the pieces together if that's of use. Okay. So this work, Highway to Infinity, is in relationship to an installation piece that I'm making. And I'm still understanding what it is exactly, but there is a focus on the power of the unconscious and the body and memories in the body. And with this work, it gets quite fantastical, and I tend to not over-explain to myself why I'm doing things. I just kind of go with my gut. So there's very much relationship with video game, cyborgs, kind of non-player characters in video games and unconsciousness that I'm really interested in exploring in this work. So that's kind of a brief of what that work is about. And thanks for having me.
Great, thank you very much. And yeah, it is. So it's interesting that you said about cyborg, because I'm not sure you were in the room when we had Valentina's workshop earlier, but you were talking about the circus body as cyborg body in relation to like the interactions with physical entities, and then watching yours, it did make me think, well, that's interaction with digital entities, which is another stage of where we're at with human connections. So I really enjoyed that. I was also going to take this opportunity to ask Hobbit if she wanted to say anything, but you sort of did it before your film, didn't you? You said you didn't want to give spoilers. Is there anything else you want to add now that we've seen it? And I think Tom's got the microphone the other side of you.
Yeah, I can just elaborate a bit more that the areas that I'm working with are with illusion and stunts, and just how we can use illusion to address the audience perception of what they're seeing on stage, and how that can be used in relation to stunt work and circus.
Cool, thank you. And I think the next logical thing to move on to talk about would be Pete's talk, because he wasn't able to give an introduction himself. As he's not here, we maybe move back to our first speakers of the day, Luke and Tom, and hear your reflections, either on Pete's talk specifically or your connections that you've been making over the day.
Ooh. Luke, do you want to go first? Or do you want me to jump in?
I think Pete's this cool story, isn't it? Wow! Oh my God! I was like blown away by it. I just thought it was super interesting. It's purely from like a circus perspective about that fact of like all of the different varieties of how it all joins together, and also like how someone can just rewrite history. Like who was it, Lord Solding or whoever he was? George Sanger, who just decided that he was a lord and that his family had nothing to do with Romany gypsies. I thought that was all really interesting. I guess I've been reflecting on in terms of this fluctuation between irony and sincerity that is inherent to metamodernism, sort of which is kind of positioned first in terms of each sort of aspect of performance, because although they are quite juxtaposed, it does feel like, to a degree, often one is at the forefront of a conversation or of a work, and the other is sort of something that underlies it. So that's just a reflection that might not be true, but I thought in my head.
Yeah, this afternoon's been fascinating, and Pete's story was really interesting because what's kind of come to the forefront of my mind today, and I'm particularly interested, so the PhD students that I supervise are all practice-based research or practice as research, and one of the things that I'm really interested in is who's doing this research and why, and I think what's come to the fore today is the individuals behind the research, and Pete's thing made me think about that because he's the only person that can do that research, right? And I actually went, well, no, actually, this is, these are the people that are doing this research. It's much more interesting to sort of, when you're in a room and you can see the people that are doing this and the reasons why they're doing things as well, has been really, really interesting. And I think one of the things that I'm taking away from today is the opportunities that people have taken to embody themselves in that research as well, and people haven't shied away from that, which has been really lovely, and I think we need more of that in academia sometimes as well. So, yeah, I think that's my main thing from this afternoon specifically.
Hello. Oh, hi. Yes. Yeah. Good. Like about the day, about just speak. Okay. It's been a really incredible introduction to metamodernism, and it's so amazing that I feel like as a circus artist is so embedded in what we do anyway, or what's going in it without having that label, and now like understanding that label a bit better means that I can kind of look at the work that's happening and understand some concerns that I had about it. It's like, oh, this feels like it's, two things at the same time, or like there's moments of joy and there's moments of like, I don't know, irony, or like this kind of like dilemma, but also in the making of circus, how you're always like, again, we talked about that pendulum of reflecting about your practice and trying to, make change or looking forward to the future, and then swinging back into like, okay, but why is this happening anyway? And then like coming back and forth with that. And yeah, it's good to, I guess, put a label onto things and understand it with a bit more depth. And yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
Thank you very much. I've been thinking over the course of the day about how interesting it is, like, having the academic world and the circus practice world in the same space, and the kind of juxtapositions and contrasts and weird, like, generative paradox that is. But I'm really pleased that you are all here from one side or the other or both, and we're making kind of, it feels like a bit of a different space for circus practitioners to talk and think, and for academics to embody. So I'm gonna move that out to you guys now to find out what you would like to talk about or ask. And Jonathan.
Thank you. I was just thinking about that idea of sort of practice as research and artistic research and things, and just that, like you say, generative paradox. Or the idea of affect, I suppose, is something that within researching circus anyway, in what I do. I run a master's in directing circus at Circomedia, and one of those pursuits, and one of the threads that goes through that, is a kind of artistic research approach to that, what is essentially a research question, I think, is how do you make circus? And I think the idea of affect being that sort of generative paradox, in the sense that you've got to try to take something which you acknowledge as being a tacit and unspoken awareness of how something is made, and you've got to try to make a methodology out of that, or you've got to ratify it or validate it within a university frame. And I think that's a really interesting thing to try to hold in your head, the idea of something that you feel that you know and something which you have to show that you know existing in the same space at the same time. And I think that's, on the one hand, you've got to make a moment that works, and on the other hand, it has to be something that's, what's that definition of affect? Something that happened that was too fast to have happened. And so there's that idea of, that holding those two things in your head at the same time, of how to leave it as an unspoken thing, but having to speak it. Yeah, I think that's the thing for me, that stands for me in the work of making circus work. Yeah.
So, anybody else around the room have questions for anybody who's presented work, or reflections of new thoughts that have been coming to you as we've kind of introduced these different threads, different ways into looking at circus work and metamodernism? Okay.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you to every contributor for their contribution. I really enjoyed the day so far. I've been sort of thinking about throughout the day about this sort of duality that is not really a duality, but it helps to think about it in that way, maybe. Between a performance that is something to be interpreted, like how do we interpret a performance or an artwork or a theater piece, versus the kind of method behind creating such a performance. So one way in which you can perform something is with a sort of sense of detachment, maybe. So I've done some, like, just as a hobby, I should make that clear, but some like poetry performances. And sometimes I could get like really detached from my own performance, but at other times it was more like I was really immersed in that situation. So I'm wondering, in addition to interpreting a piece in a metamodern way, do you, as contributors, so this is a general question, have some thoughts on the method of creating something in a more metamodern way, as opposed to having it interpreted merely as something metamodern? Does that make sense?
I might be able to answer this, and I'm starting to think a bit more about your work in terms of circus. But so this is a few years back now, but part of my PhD research was looking at what I wanted to do as a playwright and director, but also what other companies were doing. I was really interested in this idea of it's sort of as if of acting and performing, right? That we go into a space and we know that we're going to be told a story, and we kind of don't have that idea of a fourth wall anymore. And I was really interested in the idea that we could empathize with actors at the same time as characters. And so when I kind of looked into the idea of metamodernity, I was kind of like, oh, okay, what if as an experiment, and I don't think this is how people work in the real world, but as an experiment, how could we create metamodern theatre? So how could we use metamodernism as a sort of methodology? So the idea was it kind of ended up into a very meta-theatrical experience in terms of like the story that was on stage was a ridiculous story about these two characters and their lives, and was non-traditional in terms of the time and whatever. But at the same time, it was very much about, hi, I'm Faye and I'm James and I'm playing these parts, and we'll tell you about the workshops we did to create this kind of thing as well. But that was very much a kind of idea of, okay, well, how do we sort of push this as a methodology, I suppose, and I don't think kind of works in the real world. It's just like, let's make a thing that we enjoy to make as well. So there's like ways of doing that, I suppose. But it was very much an academic exercise, and taking things that I was seeing in the work that I was enjoying and the work that I was making and going, okay, well, what if we push this a bit further? What does it create in that sense as well? And it's a lovely experience. I just love storytelling. So like to have actors on stage being like, we are going to tell you a story is just always really nice for me, because I hate this idea that we sort of have this idea that maybe the fourth wall still exists, and that was, destroyed brick by brick ages ago. And what can we do outside of that now as well? But I've talked about playwriting for too long. Have we got anybody else who wants to?
I'm just thinking there about, you're talking about storytelling, and I totally see how that relates, where you focus more on theatre type work and your work as a playwright. Within circus, there's different sort of relationship to narrative, I guess. So there are circus performances that will tell a story in the kind of conventional theatrical sense, but there's also kind of a growing, body of knowledge, or want to understand what the kind of inherent metaphors are with different circus techniques, and and how those can be harnessed in a more effective way. And I can see nodding around the room, so that's good. And Luke, this is something I see in Revel Puck's work. I don't know if it's something that you consciously try and drive. Yeah, well, okay. Say a bit more about inherent metaphors of circus disciplines.
Say more about inherent metaphors of circus disciplines. I will in a sec, but I did actually have maybe something that's useful to talk to you about this, which is an example of a company that I think is making work made a body of work in a really interesting way. It's a company called Cirque Ital, who are a French company, and they made a show called Saison Cirque, which is like Season of Circus. And the way that they made this show was, they're a French, very contemporary company, in terms of the sort of institutionalization of contemporary circus. And the decision they made was, they partnered with a Finnish director who was also Russian, who had connections with very traditional Russian circus families. And so the French company had not a word of Russian, and the Russian company had not a word of French, and they made a show together, all being translated through this one Finnish person, with the main driving force being that they all wanted to make a really good circus show. The irony being that they both thought that the other's ideas were crap, but they couldn't tell them that the other's ideas were crap. And it was an amazing show. I saw it a few years ago, and it was absolutely brilliant. And it was silly, and it was funny, and it was poignant. And I think it was a good example of that being in the creative space. I don't know if that does kind of make sense in terms of it's not really getting into the kind of creative aspects of it. Inherent metaphors in circus. I guess that comes on to a bit of semantics and the inevitable semantics of society, and kind of, I guess, something that in our work we are kind of often sort of trying to challenge is the semantics. So sorry, when I say semantics, I mean the signs we give out. So you say circus to someone and they think of elephants and red-nosed clowns, and sparkly leotards and all of that kind of thing, and who's doing what within that kind of context. And so for us, it is kind of about looking at how we can take those semantics and turn them on their head, but in a kind of, fun or silly, but still, genuinely celebratory way. But yeah, I mean, I'm walking on a tightrope. Oh, it's so hard to pull myself up into the air. Maybe that relates to how I feel about my mother. I don't know. It's I think we can. You can find semantics anywhere that you want as yourself, and I think maybe that relates back to this. For me, the stance that I take of it's audience-focused creation rather than sort of for ourselves of what we see in something. It's trying to look at how we might be able to reflect something different for other people. Does that answer anything?
Doing the MA has been a really exciting opportunity to take some risks. So part of that has been developing my own practice as a director. And I have been working intuitively and finding it largely being led by my gut and what feels right, and actually what I'm uncovering. It's been really helpful to have metamodernism as a lens. in terms of relativism and truth. So the idea that, particularly when working with perception, the idea that everyone has their own truth, and then this idea of and that being the micro, and then spanning out to the macro of like what actually happened. And the place I'm at now, sort of just over halfway through the course, there's a really exciting opportunity still within this safe space of the MA to drill down on that and be like, okay, what happens if I just come from that place and I make work from that place? So the question's really interesting and really relative for me right now.
Kind of. It's more like a question back. Because I think the question has something to do with a way of making circus, of making performance in a way that is kind of like metamodern, without thinking about how it's being perceived or how it's going to be interpreted. But I find it very hard to make anything for an audience where I'm not thinking about what I'm representing. Yeah, and I wonder if maybe that in itself is kind of like part of maybe like a metamodern, I don't know, kind of like an issue with it in itself, like maybe not thinking about what you're representing at all is a little bit of like okay, now I'm making circus in a way that it's not even meant to be perceived by anyone, or yeah, or something like that. Because when we're talking about metaphors of circus, you always have to be kind of very aware of like what prop you're using, what color it is, what it's gonna say if you do a trick facing one way, but if you do a trick facing the other way, or it's like kind of like tells different things with your own body and with your own kind of like base of technique before you even layer any extra meaning with it, or you have to work with that, with your skill set as it is to kind of like tell something with it. So yeah, I just thought it was interesting that like I had never thought about it really, that like I'm always thinking about what I'm representing when I'm making, like the process itself is kind of like guided by it. Yeah, so thank you for the opportunity to reflect on that.
So to give a brief response to that, I think that's also why I phrased it as a sort of false duality, because you can never express something without an interpretation being possible, you know, so I really get your response in that regard. Yeah.
Thank you. This question is for Symoné mostly, I think, but I'd be interested if other people have responses. I really enjoyed your piece, and there were lots of things I found kind of surprising about it as it was going on. It was great. But one thing you've said since, just in your just speaking just now, you described yourself as a cabaret and circus performer and video game developer, right? And I'm interested in something I was thinking about with Pete as well, and also about being researchers or performers. I'm interested in what those categories of being a cabaret performer, a circus performer, maybe variety performer, if there are other words that you use, versus performance artist, that was the other thing you said, sort of why you would say multiple things to describe those, what's the meaningful demarcation for you, and is it to do with venues, is it to do with who is watching and how they're perceiving it, is it to do with your own performance and what you choose to put out there? And the last rambly thing I'll say about this is I think, as you were saying, Luke, circus has so many semantics associated with it that are really specific. When we say circus, people do think something, and that really varies what they think. And so, there is something at stake in saying I'm a circus performer, or for Pete to say I'm a circus performer, I'm a Romany traveler, things like that. So anyways, be curious your thoughts on that in the context of your performance.
Yeah, sure, and thank you so much. I think I'm just very aware of how if we say certain words like circus performer, it puts an image in your mind. And I think because of that awareness, I feel the need to give different labels, and it very much is based on context, the places I perform, and the expectation the audience might have. Like, I wouldn't bring this to like Western cabaret venue, you know, like I'm very aware of the places that I work and the kinds of performances that I know would work better there. And I guess as well, I like to give those different labels to show that, I mean, I guess for someone watching my work, they'll see maybe overlaps and references to different spaces. So I'm hoping that when I word it in that way, it helps that. Yeah, thank you.
I'm going to continue looking in case anybody else, but then no. Okay, yes, Jonathan.
That's okay. Do you mind? No. Thank you. Yeah, I was going to. I can't remember what I was going to say. So it was to do with a sort of structural relationship between. There's this quote by Vermeulen about how metamodernism is a departure, but also a perpetuation simultaneously. I was thinking, I was thinking that in the idea of circus technique itself, there's this idea that I'm going to give an impression that I am free from the laws of physics, let's say, for a moment. There's a free moment there, that I would depart from gravity, and that also the technique that enables me to do that is a perpetuation of those laws of physics. The laws of physics are against me. So I was just thinking that as a kind of structural thing, there's that idea of even within any circus technique itself, how you get lift, how you shift your grip, all those micro moments, as well as the big things like flying trapeze. There's two things going on at the same time. There's a kind of pendulum, which is a good circus thing anyway, but the idea of a departure from gravity, but also a perpetuation of the field itself, which you can't escape. And so there's free and not free happening at the same time. And I just think that's a really interesting thing that's sort of structurally, for me anyway, at the heart of what a circus technique is. And I think that's something specifically, well, you could argue that it's specifically metamodern, I suppose. That's just what came into my mind. Yeah.
Thank you. At the start of the day, we talked about how this was going to be exploratory, and probably some of us don't know anything about metamodernism, probably some of us don't really know anything about circus. So I'd be interested to know from people around the room what you've been surprised by today. Because Emma, you mentioned the word surprise, but I guess there's probably quite a few novel things. So who has been surprised by stuff?
Thanks, Kate. Do I need to press a button? Technology. I've been surprised by how easy it was for me to understand metamodernism based on what was said, particularly you, Tom, because I'm not a researcher. So I was just kind of thinking, I'm not saying, I've got it completely understood now, but I've got an into it. That's not very grammatical, so thank you. But actually, I also had a question which it's not going to be very, again, I think it's mostly for you, Tom, but I mean, interested in what anybody was saying. When you were talking about your reaction to forced entertainment, basically not impressed. And then you were saying, I'm paraphrasing, you said something like you expect your students, your current students, in 10 years' time to have a similar reaction to whoever. So it suggests a kind of cycle of generations just kind of going, you know what, that's not very good, or not very engaging, or whatever. How much, or do you think this is connected to physical age, Or is it to do with where people are in their professional careers? Because students are not necessarily young. I know they are usually. Do you understand what I'm asking you? Right, okay, good.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So for me, and I'm going to, this isn't sidestepping it at all, but this is how I would understand it, is that I'm really interested, and this is again why I was kind of interested by the people behind the research, but particularly within what, with a broad brush, we would label the millennial generation, and how metamodernism is, and it isn't confined to that generation at all, but I'm very interested in how particular parts of history affected that generation, particularly within Britain. And so, for me, aspects of metamodernism in terms of like hope and hopelessness, and this idea of possible lost futures and imagined futures that have never come to be, is so inherently linked to the millennials' generational experience in terms of being raised in the very prosperous 90s and noughties in certain ways, economically and politically, and then in the sort of noughties we had, well, obviously 9/11 had a big impact everywhere, but like the financial crash happened when a lot of the generation were graduating at that point as well. And so you have this kind of, I suppose, personal and cultural thing in terms of New Labour going, hey, let's make sure that everybody goes to university, and it's about, you can trace like the lineage of the words follow your passion around that time, and it goes up and up and up and up and up, and this idea of finding a passion and then finding a degree that matches that passion, and then we graduate into a world that economically and sort of all that kind of stuff doesn't correspond to that kind of idea of what we were raised to believe existed, for many reasons. And so in that sense, that's how I kind of see elements of the metamodern being inherently connected to that generation in terms of that dichotomy between hope and hopelessness and that kind of weird elements that happen there. I was talking to someone earlier about this kind of worry when I kind of got really into metamodernism that maybe it would be like a flash in the pan and it would just stop to exist very soon and I'd have to find a different area of research. And then when the pandemic came along, and obviously it's a much bigger crisis for the younger generations in some ways than the economic crash was for my generation, for instance. And I was really interested in whether you'd still find sort of metamodernism within that space and outside of that space. And then, of course, we had things like Bo Burnham's Inside comedy special. We had things like Everything Everywhere All at Once, where it's like, oh, okay, actually it's becoming more applicable in certain ways as well. So there is this kind of, for me, it's inherently, in some ways, connected to a generational experience. So I don't know if that completely sidesteps your question in terms of like age and cycles, but I do see a sort of generational cyclical kind of thing, obviously. And generational research is inherently problematic and generalizing, obviously, as well. So there's issues in terms of that. But yeah, does that answer your question at all?
Partially.
I'll take that. Did anyone else want to say yeah?
Oh, sorry. No. Thank you. I did. Sorry. Yeah. I think it's a response to late-stage capitalism. Doesn't matter what age you are, we're all living through this moment. And if you're thinking and developing thoughts at this time when the world's on fire, capitalism is crashing and burning, and we have more information than ever before, then, is the only response kind of hope in irony, hope in hopelessness? Why would it have anything to do with age rather than just in the moment that we are living through in terms of this like insane neoliberalist existential idea? Does that help?
Yeah, I think combined that answer. Sorry, that was a bit dismissive, or one-word answer. Wasn't meant to be.
I think one thing I forgot to say in my bit, and this isn't really related to circus at all, but in terms of the metamodern research, I think it's also important to kind of see how harnessed it is as an idea by the far right, particularly on the internet, and this idea of the sort of ironic sincerity in relation to like trolling and in relation to memes, which is of course like for me a very important artistic expression and something that I engage with a lot. But is this idea of like the meme is ironic, but the underlying undertone of the sincerity of it is where the real danger is. And I think that that is something that it's something that can almost be easy for people to hide behind. And like, you know, Louis Theroux's documentary when he was, I was talking to Charles about it earlier, but when he was in America meeting all of these trolls and stuff, and, you know, they were saying, yeah, it's just funny, it's just a joke, and they can really hide behind that. And I think we do need to be conscious, obviously, you know, personally I live in this lovely little left-wing bubble, but I do think it's important to be conscious of that in a performance context as well, and to recognize that as something that is intrinsic to this conversation. There you go.
Thank you. A hand up over there.
Thanks.
You don't have to press anything.
Hi. Yeah, thanks everyone so much. It's been a great day. I was curious about, I guess, circus as a global thing, and whether this discussion is different in different parts of the world, and whether your experiences and your views on these topics would be different depending on different cultures, different geographies, different traditions, and so on. I don't know how much experience you have of sort of working, like, I guess, outside the UK or anything, so I'm not sure to what extent you're able to answer that, but I'd be interested in any of your experiences.
I'm just putting my hand up because I had the same question, but I didn't know whether to ask. But also with the, like, anyone maybe on the panel not from the UK or maybe that has lived in other places is like, how is the circus different, and how is the culture more or less metamodern, maybe?
Well, I'm from Chile. I moved here 8 years ago, and I moved here to study circus. So most of my language of circus is very UK-based and European-based, and even when I go back, my friends laugh at me because I will just switch into English and Spanglish, and yeah. But I did for the Serious Circus Symposium, which was maybe, I don't remember when it was, but it was like pre-pandemic. 2018. I did like just a little retrospective about political circus in Chile and interview a couple of people about that and went to see a few things. I promise I will come back to metamodernism, but and everybody that I asked just about if they were doing political circus or if they thought that their work was political, which is something that in the UK like has been happening quite a lot. There's quite a lot of satire. There's quite a lot of political statements being made in performance, and it's kind of like going into circus. But in Chile, people were just inherently not seeing that. They were like, no, my work is not political, although they were using kind of like references of circus and whatnot. And I think in the same way, I find that the conversations that I've had with circus artists in Chile is that they're just more, they don't really, it's not that they don't think about it, that they don't care about going into the depths of what their work might be saying or might be not saying or what it means. I think that is there for sure, but as a kind of like collective, I think people are just more worried about getting work and being able to perform and live with performance. And it's just harder in Chile because there's less funding opportunities. And also, like in Europe is really small. If you don't have work in one country and you're European citizen, you can go to the next country, 2 hours on your car, and then get work there, and it's kind of like fine. Chile is long, and it's like hard to get from A to B and across. Like we have the Andes, so yeah, I think at the moment people are more worried about just kind of like doing the work and performing it rather than maybe contemplating what the work might mean. I think there's still people thinking about it, but I haven't found myself in situations where there's this kind of events. Again, not that they don't exist. I don't live there. I lived there 8 years ago. I go back, but it's, yeah, I think that's, yeah. I don't know if that would respond to questions, yeah.
I studied in France, and so and lived and worked there for a number of years as well. And so in the French context, which is very specific, even in the European context, there's so much money, man. People are just paid. You're just paid and paid and paid to play and play and play and research and research and research. So yeah, it's thought about one hell of a lot. It's always very artist focused. I kind of noticed from the discussions I had, but yeah, I think the French context is very particular, whereas in a lot of other countries, I think it is more similar to Chile and, not Chile, to the UK, which is where there is some funding, but it's very competitive, and so people, do need to kind of make ends meet through their performance as well. In terms of the artist-to-artist relationships, I think it's really true that circus is an international form, and language is important, but also it's such a kind of physical art form, and everyone's so used to moving so much that there is a real sense of kind of sharing and exploring different ideas. There's also quite an interesting thing of the individual identity within circus, kind of specific to circus artists, and a circus writer called Zachary has just published a piece on this in terms of juggling, which is we're very protective of our individual technique as an artist, and I develop my tricks and no one copies my tricks. That's how I throw that. And I think that's quite interesting when you look at it into a broader context of people developing and creating work. And it's when are ideas growing and bouncing, and when are ideas stifled because someone doesn't want to do something in that way because someone else did it a bit like that before them, which I think is probably true in lots of art forms, but it's quite clear cut in circus at the moment, if that's helpful at all.
Gillian, I did notice you nodding. Would you like to say anything about Australian context? You have the time I take to cross the room with the mic to think about something. Sorry, you can say no. Fine.
Australia had closed borders for a very long time due to the pandemic. I see a lot of what Tom describes as metamodern as running as a strong theme through the work of Circus Oz since the 1980s. So I think there would be possibly, and I will never ever speak for a circus artist, I'm an academic, but I came to the academy from live performance in comedy and mask and physical theatre, but not circus. In Australia, irony is part of our sense of humour. So I see a lot of what was described as characteristics in the work of Circus Oz. They're now a historic company. I mean, there have been so many companies that have come out more recently. I guess internationally, people might know Circa or Gravity and Other Myths and other smaller troupes. So I can't really speak, but what I can say is to echo this Zoom show that you talked about in 2020. So contemporary variety/circus artists in Australia ran a Zoom variety show for about 10 weeks. We were very sad when it finished. And it was very much people in there at home dancing around when asked. It really embodied these characteristics of irony, but the homeliness, the need that everyone was feeling in an island continent with borders closed to entertain one another and be entertained about what it is to be human, to be close. Shows about cooking. The one my daughter loved most was the performers were naked. The woman was in the bath, her accompanist was a naked double bassist. But they're variety performers. Many of them, had come from the circus variety field, and they were all out of work. And so we paid a donation to get the Zoom link. So these are very strong resonances. And I was saying to you before, I came to the Academy late. and I inherited this insistence on teaching forced entertainment. And around 2009, 2010, I realised these students are really not interested in this. But as a teacher of performing and making new performance, you see, I think they taught me a lot about what you're talking about. So it belongs, I feel like the younger generation, younger than me, I'm in my mid-60s now, because postmodernism never worked for me, either when I was making work or when I came to the academy. So, you know, I'm curious, what I've learned today is to really examine this label. Telling me off. I could talk underwater, Kate, so I might finish. Can I just say I'm really heartened to hear people challenging the Astley origin myth today. I've just spent 2 weeks in the British Library looking at a lot of very early stuff and going, wow, he didn't really invent anything, did he? Which is what we'll be publishing.
Thank you. So we've got 10 minutes left of this session as it's programmed in. So I'm still interested in that question of surprises, I suppose, around the room, or if anybody else has something that they'd like to ask before we run out of time.
I've got a question. You see, because I'm a cultural historian, I'm really interested, and you've sort of touched on it, I guess. The shifts in cultural product come from what's around us. I mean, so many theorists of the circus have said the circus is a mirror at different times. So Paul Buisac, with his circus and semiotics, says the circus is a mirror. It's why it's constantly changing. So what is it that has brought this shift? I think you've sort of touched on it. You talk about the politics in this country and the end of capitalism and the horrors of everything else. But that's really my question. I don't expect anyone to answer it today. But there have been major cultural shifts that are giving rise to a new way of making work and saying different things. So, that's my question. I don't think it can be answered quickly.
I have a Canadian colleague who calls this double fisting. For those of you on Zoom, I'm holding 2 microphones. Does anybody have an answer for Gillian right now, or is that one to ponder? Like whether there's anything specific in cultural shifts that have happened that have prompted, but we have touched on some of these elements, like the economic situation and environmental situation.
Sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
I think we're, in relation to gender politics, is really interesting, this sort of idea of non-binary, and I think metamodernism really addresses that idea very simply. I think there's a lot of readjustment about how we interact with the world and the people around us. I think it's really important, and it's really good that it's coming into, this sort of political, the wider sort of political divides that are happening and have been happening are really inspiratory of more discourse around what we want to see, and if we're not seeing the things that we want to see, how we can engage with that and how we can create those things ourselves. So yeah, I think there feels like a big shift happening, not just with sort of gender politics, but with race and class. And there's a whole. I think there's a big shift just generally that I think is really useful. That metamodernism really helps to it's a really nice lens for that.
Oh.
Sorry, yeah, just quickly. Yeah, just in thinking about that, like, what is the shift, or like within the circus anyway? I think there's that figure of the figure who kind of dominates the spectacle, or dominates the object, or dominates the animal, or this kind of figure. I think is no longer believable. But also that figure that creates a transcendent moment of freedom for themselves on the stage by flying through the air. That figure is also somehow in the hopelessness no longer believable as well. And so we're trying to find some other way to inhabit hope, knowing that that figure is no longer believable, if you see what I mean. So I think there's something to do with that, maybe, that those circus figures aren't believable to us anymore, but we still want to inhabit that moment somehow. Yeah.
Yeah, just on that, maybe this is just a reflection now, but potentially, like, circus has always been something about, like, aspiration and, like, delivering on aspirations, and maybe us as a society, our aspirations are kind of being redefined globally, and that thing of, like, circus, I'm literally just absorbing what people have said now, so I don't know if any of this is true, but, like, that thing of, like, circus as a mirror, and how our aspirations are shifting, and so what does that mean? And yeah, in the sort of modernist era, the aspiration was to be dominant and all superior, and you know, we can see that really clearly reflected in the circus. And now, what are our aspirations for ourselves, for our children, for the future, and how does circus take that on and reflect it in a new way?
We have currently one person on Zoom. So I would just say, Nadine on Zoom, do you have anything that you would like to ask the room? I know you've not been here for all of the day.
Thank you for the opportunity. I don't have any questions listening in from California. It is still very, very early.
Okay, thank you. So I think that's a nice note to wrap up on aspirations and how those are changing, because aspirations are something all of us have, and we all exist to greater or lesser degrees in and out of the same societal. It's making me think of Valentina talking earlier about the gases that we're breathing in and out being a membrane that we all interact with slightly differently, but we're all a part of it. So, yes, that's what I'm going to leave with. Our aspirations are all in and out of the same membrane of the world. We're going to wrap up this session, and then Tom is just going to come in and do some closing notes, and then there'll be some more tea and coffee, a chance for you to chat amongst yourselves, and any of you who are then interested in staying to find out a bit more about how we can document some of these ideas that was mentioned earlier. We have got funding to publish a booklet, which it could be as academic or as drawing and poemy as we like. We get to choose. So I hope some of you stay and we can put our heads together about how we're going to fill these pages that somebody's paying us to put out into the world. Stretch your legs while I go and check if Tom is nearly ready, and then we can close up in here. Thank you.
Yeah.